Hi everyone, I'm Casey Prashante. I'm a professional astrologer, and today I wanted to do kind of like a brief presentation on how you can search for uh, transits, progressions, and solar arc directions that might indicate someone is getting married, or what you can expect to see when someone gets married. You'll see it in the individual's chart and the potential spouse's chart. There's no real point looking too far ahead for these because you have a life to live until that time comes. But if you are expecting to get married or recently engaged and you're unsure of if it's going to happen sooner or later or anything like that, these are some indicators you can look for that will give you the information of when a marriage is likely to occur. So I'll share my screen and I'll go through transits, progressions, solar arc directions that were active for both me and my husband at the time we got married. Um, I think I might actually start with my husband's chart because I have a lot more indicators actually than he does. And this is how I rectified my husband's chart as well. I'm not like an expert in rectification or anything like that. It's just that he was either a late degree Leo rising or early degree Virgo rising. And when I was looking at um, our marriage transits and stuff like that, things just weren't adding up with the Leo rising, which he was more likely to be a Leo rising based on the time span I was given from when he was born. Um, but like it didn't make sense, and I'll explain why. So he had transiting Pluto at the time, and I'll just annotate this as well. Transiting Pluto was conjunct his Neptune, which isn't really a big deal because millions of people all over the world would have gone through that exact transit at the same time. Anyone born from probably 19 early 1996 until early 1997 would have Neptune in this place more or less. But this becomes important because Mercury is the ruler of his seventh house, and whenever someone gets married, you'll see um, outer planet transits to the seventh house ruler is like that's a big one that you want to look for because it means that there are major changes happening in that person's life regarding the partner because the seventh house represents the partner a lot of times. So Pluto represents huge transformation. It's the most transpersonal planet. If he was a Leo rising and had Aquarius on his seventh house cusp, this transit wouldn't mean anything. But with the 0 degree Pisces descendant, that's a big deal, and that's just one of the signifiers that helped me, rectify his chart a bit. Um, he also had transiting Neptune squaring his Venus, and I don't have the degrees written down, so you have to take my word for it. But transiting Neptune would have been in Pisces in his seventh house, and it would have been squaring Neptune in his chart. And he has an unaspected Neptune. I don't look at, I mean, unaspected Venus. I don't look at out of sign aspects very much, but with the ruler of his seventh house squaring Venus, which rules love and relationship for everybody, and in a man's chart, it's kind of girlfriend or the feminine energy in his life. That again is just kind of it's a square, so he probably was feeling more idealistic around this time about me and about our marriage, especially as someone that has a natal moon Saturn square in the seventh house. He's someone that's a bit more, serious and not kind of um, totally lovey-dovey and romantic or anything like that. But during this time, he would have been feeling romantic with the ruler of his seventh house in his seventh house squaring Venus, which is love and relationship for everyone. Um, so this is another indicator that the individual with this chart would be getting married around this time. And these were all active when we got married. Um, so there's that. I'll clear it all. And then he also had, this is how another reason I know he has a Pisces descendant. He had Jupiter exactly conjunct his seventh house cusp at the time we got married. Again, if he had a Leo rising and Aquarius descendant, this wouldn't mean anything. Um, so with the Virgo rising Pisces descendant, this means everything because Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces, and Jupiter conjunct the seventh house cusp for anyone uh, can be a signifier of somebody getting married, though not always. But in this case, because we were already engaged and we were planning to get married, this is kind of, reiterates that uh, this was actually going to happen. And with Jupiter being the great benefic, that's always nice. So he also had, mm, this is a more minor transit. Um, he would have had Jupiter in his sixth house, which again doesn't really mean much regarding marriage, but it was making a trine to his midheaven. And a lot of the time, men typically, though not always, it's just something I've noticed, men are going to have more, more likely they're going to have activity around their midheaven and their descendant when they get married. Less, I mean, if something's aspecting the midheaven, it's going to aspect the fourth house cusp, and if something's aspecting the descendant, it's going to aspect the ascendant as well. But when I look at men's charts, a lot of the time it's the descendant that will have conjunctions to it and the midheaven that will have more loud aspects a lot of the time. And when women get married, it's the ascendant and the fourth house cusp. Um, but this becomes important because Saturn is stability. In the higher vibration, it's stability and longevity, and a kind of its respectability to his midheaven, which is his reputation and status. And when men get married, at least in my case as well, but I think this is kind of very common, even like cross-culturally, men get a huge boost in status when they get married. My husband got like three promotions in the span of like maybe 6 months. He got like he was working casually in Australia. That's kind of just, um, you get paid hourly, but you don't get like sick leave or anything like that, but you can make a lot of money working casually. Like right before our wedding, he got offered a full-time job, and then he got like two more promotions after that, I think. Um, one after the next. And a lot of that was circumstantial, but I think a lot of it actually had to do with the fact that he was a young married guy and not just some kind of, I don't want to say bachelor, but we weren't just boyfriend, girlfriend anymore. So that, again, this isn't a huge indicator, but this would bolster the fact that this individual would be getting married, especially because he has Saturn in his seventh house. And when you're looking at relationship astrology, you don't just want to look at the sign on the seventh house cusp. You're going to want to look at planets in the seventh house because that will represent any kind of partnership and potentially the partner as well. And if we look at his progression, so those were he had more transits, but these were the ones that were the loudest regarding what happened. And no real point, in my opinion, looking at the minor transits unless you wanted to time something. We knew when we were getting married, anyways. Um, so moving on to the progressions, he had his progressed moon exactly conjunct his natal seventh house cusp. Again, this helped me rectify his birth chart and, really kind of, woke me up to the fact that he was actually a Virgo rising after thinking he was a Leo rising for so long. Um, the progressed moon conjunct the seventh house cusp. Again, it's not going to mean that this person is going to get married, but this would help define the timing because the progressed moon moves about a degree a month. Um, and with the progressed moon conjunct the seventh house cusp, which has to do with marriage, we would be able to narrow down that this individual would have gotten married around May, which is when we did get married. And additionally, he had his progressed ascendant. So his normal ascendant, natal ascendant, is 0 degrees of Virgo. He had his progressed ascendant at, I think it was 5-ish degrees of Libra. So his ascendant moved into Libra a few years before, probably around the time we started dating, actually. And it was making an opposition to Saturn. Again, in other people's charts, it might not mean a huge um, change in, relationship status, though it could. But with Saturn being in his seventh house natally, this would indicate because the ascendant descendant axis is the axis of relationship. So this would mean he's going into some kind of long-term partnership, serious partnership, and that is what marriage is. And he also had his progressed his progressed midheaven was at 3 degrees of Cancer, so around here. So his midheaven is at his natal midheaven is at 10 degrees of Gemini. He had his progressed midheaven at 3 degrees of Cancer, and that was also squaring his natal Saturn. So, you know, I don't even know how many indicators that is now. Probably it's over five. Um, So he had the transiting Saturn trining his midheaven, and then his progressed midheaven squaring that Saturn, and then his progressed ascendant opposite his Saturn. Um, when the angles are involved in, especially the progressed angles are involved in a configuration like this, and it's involving a planet in the seventh house, chances are that person's getting married. He also had, regarding his solar arcs, he had Saturn equals Neptune. Saturn equals Neptune, which for most other individuals probably wouldn't mean that much. That would mean like a dissolving of boundaries when you take into consideration that Neptune rules his seventh house cusp, Saturn's in his seventh house, conjunct the moon, which is, a lot of people consider that to be the wife. Um, this is another huge indication that something is happening regarding partnership with this person. And he also had Mars equals Pluto around this time. I wouldn't consider that a marriage aspect, but it was active at the time. Mars is in his eighth house of, um, the spouse's resources. I don't think he got anything from me, but maybe he did because I'll explain a little bit more when I do my chart. Um, Transformation around what the partner brings to the table and the partner's assets, more or less. But I would consider that to be a huge marriage indicator in his chart, just because there's not enough evidence to say that it is. But that was active at the time. So now if you look at my chart and the transits that I had, so this is my chart. Where's pen? Yeah. And I had much louder transits than he had. So if you're kind of like not newish, but a little bit more advanced in astrology, my husband's chart might be more of a challenge to consolidate in your mind and understand how that would mean marriage. The seventh house transits and progressions were quite loud, but especially with that solar arc of Saturn equals Neptune, that's when you would need to kind of like, really use your astrologer brain and say to yourself, okay, Neptune rules the seventh house, Saturn's in his seventh house, there's something going on with partnership, and not just say, um, he might potentially be getting a divorce because Neptune would dissolve the partnership. Um, does that make sense? I hope so. So with my chart, I had transiting Pluto conjunct my midheaven, which would be a huge change in status and how I'm seen in the world, a transformation of how I'm seen in the world. And that was about 2 degrees away, I think. But at the time that we got married, I had transiting Pluto exactly square my ascendant, which is the relationship axis. So there were huge transformations to my personality, my identity, my name, everything like that. So, and you know, when you kind of get into transits and learning about them and everything like that, it can be really overwhelming. But if it's something like Pluto conjunct the midheaven, but it's exactly squaring the ascendant, I think the square to the ascendant will take precedence, even though the conjunction is kind of like a louder aspect, just because it was so exact at the time we got married that you can't kind of ignore that. But it's essentially saying the exact same thing. There are huge changes going on in my life. The most transpersonal planet aspecting the most personal points in an individual's chart. Something big was happening around this time for this individual who was me. But if you were looking at it, just the charts and the transits that were happening, um, you would understand this. And I think this is even more obvious when you consider that I have Venus opposite Pluto in my natal chart, because Venus rules my seventh house. So, if someone has Pluto conjunct the ascendant squaring the midheaven, I mean, Pluto conjunct the midheaven squaring the ascendant, that might mean a totally different thing. Um, if we just say this is, Joe Blogg's chart, he doesn't have a Venus Pluto aspect, that might mean something totally different. But considering that I have the opposition of Pluto to my Venus, which rules my seventh house, it becomes more obvious this has something to do with finances, because it's across the financial axis as well, the second and the eighth, and partnership because it's ruling my seventh house. So that was by far the loudest transit that was active when I got married. I also um, had Neptune squaring my Mars, which doesn't sound like um, a marriage transit, and it's really not for most people. But when you take into consideration that Mars is my chart ruler because I'm an Aries rising. I think this would just kind of give testimony to the fact that I was feeling, again, like quite idealistic around this time. Mars can represent men in a woman's chart, particularly young men, especially in a young woman's chart. It can represent the boyfriend, um, but also because I am Mars in my chart, I think this just says more about the fact that I was feeling very romantic around this time, very idealistic around this time, and but because it is a square, you don't just want to say, nice things. You also want to take into consideration that I was probably overly idealistic around this time, really had my rose-colored glasses on, and maybe didn't put as much thought into the gravity of getting. I'm not saying I regret my marriage or anything like that, but it's kind of there was a naivety there for both of us because my husband had Venus transiting Venus square his natal Venus, and we had Neptune square my natal Mars, so there was some kind of naivety there regarding when we got married. And then I was also experiencing my Uranus square. So I had transiting Uranus in my first house of identity, and this was squaring my natal Uranus in the 10th house of status. And for me, this would speak to the fact that I was kind of breaking out. Okay, I don't hear many astrologers talking about this, but Aries risings a lot of the time they break away from the family quite early. I did move out of my family home early. I kind of individuated much earlier than most people, and with that Uranus square, there was a real I wouldn't say impulsiveness. There was just an impatience and a real frustration with my life direction at the time, and even if I wasn't engaged or in a relationship or anything like that, with the Pluto conjunct the midheaven, square the ascendant, and also experiencing my Uranus square, you can say something big was going to happen to me in my life at this time. And with Uranus in the first house, regard changes to my identity, squaring Uranus in my 10th house, the house of status and how I'm seen in the world. This, in my opinion, would be a huge marriage indicator just because of the houses alone and the fact that there are a lot of people that get married during their Uranus squares, because they also experience their Saturn squares at the same time. And I have certain indications in my chart that say I was marrying essentially a substitute parent. Liz Green talks about this like really, really well. Um, she phrases it really, really well in her book on Uranus, The Art of Stealing Fire. I would really recommend that book alone just for the information on the Saturn square and the Uranus square. So I would consider this to be a marriage indicator for me. And if anyone else has Uranus in their 10th house and experiences um, a Uranus, the Uranus square with Uranus in their first house, that can be a marriage indicator just because of the change in status and their identity, which happens when you get married, especially with the name change. Um, I also experienced okay. I'll move on to the progressions because I don't think these other transits are like super relevant. I was experiencing my progressed sun conjunct my okay. My progressed sun was conjunct my fourth house cusp. It was also squaring my ascendant. And because of the conjunction to my fourth house cusp, it was opposite my midheaven. So, what would that say? The sun represents our purpose in life and our mission. With my progressed sun conjuncting my fourth house cusp, especially in Cancer, I was kind of withdrawing from the world, squaring my ascendant, which is in Aries, and it's a very independent sign. Um, there was some tension there because I wanted to do things with my life, and yet here I was getting married and getting kind of very insulated from the world and not putting myself out there and not doing things. And then, opposite with the progressed sun being opposite the midheaven, I wasn't really directing my life to the outside world. I was directing my house to the home. And that becomes even more, by far, I think, the most prevalent progression. And I would say the Pluto conjunct midheaven square the ascendant was the loudest marriage transit for me, the loudest marriage signifier for me. but the second largest one, you know, actually, no, I think this progression is by far more important because this happens quite rarely. I think my progressive Venus is going to ingress into Leo, and I don't think it's going to get further than that because I think it goes retrograde at some point. But I was experiencing on my wedding day, I had my progressed Venus ingressing into Cancer, literally 0 degrees, 0 minutes of Cancer on my wedding day. And this is, I didn't plan this. This is before I was practicing astrologer. I don't even think I was a student of astrology. I was just interested in astrology. I didn't know about progressions at this time. On the day that I married, my progressed Venus ingressed into Cancer. And remember, Venus is love and relationships for everyone. In a woman's chart, it's her femininity. And in my chart specifically, it rules my seventh house of partnership. And when a progressed planet changes signs, that's a huge deal. And with it ingressing into Cancer, that's when I became a housewife and I wasn't working. I hardly ever left the apartment from my own choice. It's not like my husband, kept me there or anything. But progressed Venus ingressing into Cancer, becoming a housewife, my progressed Sun conjunct the fourth house cusp, withdrawing from the world, squaring the ascendant, um, squaring my Aries ascendant. I was not active. I was not an active participant in my own life. It felt like I just felt very insular around this time because progressions have a lot to do with internal changes and less about external changes and events happening to us. It's just our personality kind of shifting gears a little bit. Um, and I wasn't experiencing any solar arcs around this time. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that because I didn't want to make this like too intensive. Um, but I hope you learned something from this. I hope I, was able to express these phenomenon in a kind of a cohesive kind of way. And I hope that by using the loudest transits and progressions and solar arcs, that it was easy for you to follow and kind of understand what marriage indicators look like in two different people's charts. Because I was experiencing, a huge Pluto conjunct my midheaven square my ascendant and that is super relevant in my chart because I have Pluto opposite Venus, which would have to do with some kind of relating, some kind of change in relationships. Whereas my husband was experiencing, Neptune conjunct his descendant and Neptune squaring his Venus, which would be, intense idealism and romance in a man's chart. Um, and especially with the Pluto conjunct his Neptune, that means nothing for most people. But when he had Pisces on his descendant, that meant a lot. Um, because he also has Pluto squaring his ascendant descendant axis. I don't think I mentioned that, but he does. So any kind of Pluto transit to the ruler of his seventh house, chances are would have something to do with the fact of some kind of intense partnership. So yeah, thank you for watching. And I'm not naked, I'm wearing a strapless dress. But yeah, see you in my next video. Bye.